Hi, everyone. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm so glad you're here with me today because we're diving into a story that isn't just about crime. In the traditional sense, it's about power greed and the kind of damage that doesn't always leave fingerprints. This is the story of Monsanto, a company that promised to feed the world, but instead left behind poisoned towns, devastated families, and a shadow that still follows us today. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's uncover the dark history that connects our food, our health, and one of the most controversial companies the world has ever known. Chapter 1: Poisoned Town. The Tragedy of Anniston. When I first read about Anniston, Alabama, it almost didn't feel real. A small southern town in the 1960s where families worked hard, went to church on Sundays, and raised their children near streams and fields that seemed so ordinary, so safe. But beneath that picture of small-town America was something sinister, something that would haunt generations. Anniston was home to a Monsanto plant, one of the company's key factories. At the time, most people thought Monsanto was a symbol of progress, part of America's booming post-war industry. They were producing a chemical called PCB, which was widely used in electrical equipment. No one in town really knew what PCB was, and if they did, they trusted that it was safe. After all, this was America. Surely a company this powerful wouldn't be allowed to poison its neighbors, right? But the truth was far darker. For decades, Monsanto dumped millions of pounds of PCB waste directly into the streams, the soil, and even open landfills around Anniston. People noticed strange things. The fish in the creeks didn't just die, they disintegrated. Some were found floating belly up within seconds of swimming through the water. Kids who played near the streams would come home with rashes. Families started to see a disturbing pattern: higher rates of cancer, unusual illnesses, memory loss, and children born with health problems. The thing that still chills me is how much Monsanto knew. Internal documents later revealed that as early as the 1930s, they were aware PCBs were toxic. They ran animal studies showing tumors in rats. But instead of pulling the product, Monsanto's own scientists manipulated the reports to say PCBs were safe. They literally rewrote the findings to protect the company's profits and the people of Anniston. They weren't told anything. They lived, worked, and breathed in a poisoned environment without ever knowing the scale of what was happening. Generations grew up in that town, trusting the company that was quietly destroying their health. By the time the truth came out, it was too late. PCBs don't just disappear. They persist in the environment for decades, traveling through the food chain, building up in human tissue. The residents of Anniston had some of the highest PCB blood levels ever recorded. Lawsuits followed, of course, and in 2003, Monsanto finally had to pay damages $43 million to settle. But when you break that down across thousands of victims, some families got just a few $1,000s. A few $1,000s for a lifetime of sickness, for losing loved ones, for never being able to trust the ground beneath their feet again. And here's the part that really stings. Monsanto knew this would happen. They saw the studies, they saw the dead fish, they knew their neighbors were being poisoned. But money mattered more. Reputation mattered more. The lives of ordinary people in Anniston, they were collateral damage. When I think of Anniston, I don't just see statistics or lawsuits. I see a community betrayed, parents burying their children too young, workers who thought they had stable jobs, not knowing those jobs were slowly killing them. And the silence, the deafening silence of a corporation that chose profit over humanity. This is where the story of Monsanto really begins for me. Not with big slogans about innovation or futuristic homes made of plastic, but with a quiet southern town where people's trust was shattered forever. Anniston was the warning sign the world ignored. And if history tells us anything, it's that Monsanto's crimes didn't stop there, they only grew bigger. Chapter 2: From Sweetener to Superpower. Whenever we talk about Monsanto, most people jump straight to Agent Orange or GMOs. But to really understand how this company became so powerful, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to 1901, when a man named John Francis Queeny decided to start a little chemical company in St. Louis, Missouri. Queeny wasn't a household name, and Monsanto wasn't born out of some noble dream to feed the world. It started with something simple: saccharin, an artificial sweetener. At the time, saccharin was a hot new product marketed as a calorie-free sugar substitute. One of Queenie's first and biggest customers was none other than Coca-Cola. That partnership gave Monsanto a steady foothold in American households long before anyone realized what the name would come to represent. By the 1920s and 1930s, Monsanto wasn't just dabbling in sweeteners anymore. They were diving headfirst into chemicals, synthetics, plastics, and industrial materials that fueled America's growth. During World War II, they supplied styrene and other materials needed for rubber and weapons. Monsanto became a critical piece of the war machine, and with that came influence, government contracts, and a reputation for innovation. After the war, the company leaned heavily into marketing itself as the face of progress. They weren't just selling products, they were selling a vision of the future. One of their most famous PR stunts was the House of the Future at Disneyland in the 1950s. Picture it, a sleek modern home made almost entirely out of plastics, chemicals, and synthetics, all materials pioneered by companies like Monsanto. Visitors walked through it and saw a shining example of how science could make life easier, cleaner, and more modern. To the average family, Monsanto looked like a company building the American dream. But here's the thing that stands out to me: behind the glossy ads and futuristic displays, Monsanto was laying the foundation for a darker legacy. They weren't just making harmless consumer goods, they were moving into powerful chemicals, things like PCBs, DDT, and herbicides products that made them billions, but also came with devastating consequences. It's important to remember the context of that time. In mid-20th century America, science was worshipped. If a company said a product was safe, most people believed it. Regulators didn't have the tools or maybe even the will to challenge big corporations. So Monsanto grew and grew, feeding off America's optimism about technology. And that's how they shifted from a small saccharin supplier into a chemical superpower. By the 1950s and 1960s, they weren't just one of many players, they were shaping entire industries. They had their hands in agriculture, manufacturing food, and even military contracts. They were everywhere. What's unsettling is how calculated it all seems when you look back. Monsanto learned early on that if they controlled not just the products, but the story around those products, they could shape public opinion. They knew how to present themselves as innovators, as saviors of modern life, even while producing chemicals that would later be proven toxic. When I think about this rise, it reminds me of how power rarely comes all at once. It's built piece by piece on small victories, clever marketing, and well-timed partnerships. Monsanto didn't start as the villain, it started as a businessman selling sweetener. But power has a way of corrupting, especially when profits become the only thing that matters. By the time Monsanto had cemented its place as an industrial giant, the world was on the brink of something huge: the Vietnam War. And it was during that war that Monsanto's story shifted from being a tale of corporate growth to a tale of crime on a scale that still echoes today. Chapter 3: Agent Orange and the Vietnam War. When I first learned about Agent Orange, I thought it was just another chapter in the history of war, like napalm or machine guns, something terrible but necessary for combat. But the truth is so much darker than that. Agent Orange wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a chemical experiment unleashed on millions of people, and its consequences are still with us today. To understand how it happened, we have to step into the mindset of the 1960s. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the United States had ever faced. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and a determined enemy who used the land itself as cover. American soldiers couldn't see who they were fighting. Every tree, every vine, every rice field could hide danger. And that terrified military strategists. So they turned to science, or more specifically, to Monsanto. The idea was simple, but brutal. If the jungle was giving cover to the enemy, then destroy the jungle. Strip away the leaves, the crops, the food. Force the enemy out into the open. It was called Operation Ranch Hand. From 1962 to 1971, planes sprayed over 20 million gallons of herbicides across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Agent Orange was the most infamous of these chemicals. Now here's the chilling part. Monsanto knew long before that Agent Orange wasn't safe. As early as the late 1940s, their own research showed that the dioxins inside this chemical cocktail were deadly, not just to plants, but to humans. Dioxins are some of the most toxic substances ever created. Even tiny amounts can cause cancer's reproductive problems, birth defects, and permanent changes to DNA. But none of that stopped them. Agent Orange became the military's weapon of choice. And so, for nearly a decade, the skies over Southeast Asia rained poison. The official story was that Agent Orange was meant to save lives by exposing the enemy. But think about who else lived under those jungles' families: children, entire villages, farmers working their fields, mothers carrying babies, American soldiers themselves stationed right in the middle of these toxic clouds. They were all exposed. The results were catastrophic. Over 400,000 people were killed. Millions more developed cancers, skin diseases, and neurological disorders. To this day, decades after the last plane sprayed its load, babies are still being born with birth defects linked to Agent Orange. Spina bifida, missing limbs, heart conditions, disorders that rip entire families apart. This wasn't just a weapon of war, it was generational destruction. And here's the part that makes my blood boil. Monsanto and the US government both knew. They had evidence, they had warnings, and yet they went forward. They decided military strategy outweighed human life. I try to imagine what it must have been like for those Vietnamese families watching their rice fields shrivel overnight, their children developing strange illnesses, their communities forever altered. Or for the American veterans, young men who thought they were serving their country only to come home decades later with cancers, with disabilities, and with children who carried the burden of chemical damage in their own bodies. In 1984, U.S. veterans sued the makers of Agent Orange. Monsanto denied responsibility as they always did, but eventually settled for $180 million. That sounds like a lot of money until you realize it was divided among thousands of veterans, many of whom were left permanently disabled. For them, no amount of money could undo what had been done. And the Vietnamese victims? They received nothing. When they tried to bring their case to U.S. courts in 2005, it was dismissed. Why? Because they weren't American citizens. Think about that. Entire generations destroyed and no justice, no accountability. What stays with me is this chilling truth: Agent Orange didn't just kill. It rewrote human lives. It seeped into DNA, altering the very blueprint of families. Today, you can walk into hospitals in Vietnam and still see children suffering from conditions linked directly to that spraying half a century ago. That's how far-reaching it was. That's how deep the scars go. And yet, Monsanto survived. They paid settlements, sure, but they continued to thrive, to make billions, to present themselves as innovators in agriculture. They buried their crimes beneath layers of money marketing and legal loopholes. When I reflect on Agent Orange, I don't just see a tragedy of war. I see a crime committed against humanity. A crime where corporations, governments, and science itself were twisted into tools of destruction. And the worst part? This was only one chapter in Monsanto's story. The chemical empire they built didn't stop with Agent Orange. It evolved, finding new ways to control farming food and human health. For me, this is where the story of Monsanto stops being about bad business practices and becomes something far darker. This is where their fingerprints turn into bloodstains. Chapter 4: The Silent Poison of Anniston. When I think about the dangers of chemical companies, my mind always goes back to one small town in Alabama, Anniston. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in an old movie church on Sunday mornings, neighbors who all knew each other by name, kids playing outside until the streetlights came on. It should have been safe, quiet, ordinary. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, something sinister was poisoning the entire community. Back in the 1930s, Monsanto set up a factory in Anniston. On paper, it seemed like a blessing. Jobs for locals, steady paychecks, a chance for families to have some stability during hard times. But what no one realized was that this factory wasn't just producing chemicals, it was also quietly dumping its waste straight into the creeks, the soil, and the very environment people depended on to survive. The main chemical PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, Even the name sounds toxic. These compounds were used in electrical equipment paints and all sorts of industrial products. Monsanto made millions off them, but for the people of Anniston, PCBs became a slow-moving death sentence. Rumors started small. A man walking across a landfill and his shoes literally burned off. Fish pulled from local streams dying in seconds, their bodies covered in sores, blood spilling from their gills. Families who had lived in the same neighborhood for generations began noticing something strange, neighbors all getting sick at the same time, cancers clustering in entire streets, children developing unexplained illnesses. Imagine this: you grow your own vegetables, raise pigs in your backyard, fish from the creek behind your house. That was daily life in Anniston. Except the soil was poisoned, the water was toxic, and the food itself carried invisible chemicals. People were literally feeding their families with poison without ever knowing it. By the 1960s, the signs were impossible to ignore. Fish in nearby creeks tested at 7,500 times the legal limit for PCBs. Think about that. Not just unsafe, but catastrophically contaminated. Monsanto's own workers saw it firsthand. They knew the water was killing everything that touched it. But instead of sounding the alarm, the company downplayed the danger. They even went so far as to alter scientific test results, changing reports, to say that PCBs were not cancer-causing. A lie printed on paper to protect profits while families around them wasted away. Residents began to suffer in terrifying ways: memory loss, autoimmune disorders, kidney failure, breathing problems, and cancers that tore through families one after another. People were too sick to work, too sick to live normal lives, and yet no one was held accountable. Monsanto was the biggest employer in town. How do you speak out against the hand that feeds you, even if that same hand is slowly killing you? By the time the factory finally shut down in 1971, it was too late. The PCBs weren't gone. They had seeped into everything: soil, water, and even human bodies. They became known as brain thieves because of the way they attacked the nervous system and rewired the brain. Parents buried children. Entire families struggled with permanent disabilities, and still, Monsanto told the world their chemicals were safe in small amounts. Decades later, in 2003, Anniston residents won a settlement, $43 million. But when divided among thousands of people, that money was almost insulting. $9,000 per adult, $2,000 per child. That was the price Monsanto put on a lifetime of suffering on cancers that robbed people of years, on children born with irreversible health problems. And here's what keeps me up at night. Anniston wasn't unique. It was just one of the towns where Monsanto tested the limits of how much destruction they could get away with. And they did get away with it for decades. The people of Anniston became living proof of what happens when profit comes before humanity. I can't stop thinking about those quiet southern streets, the families who thought they were safe, and the invisible poison that was changing them forever. Anniston isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. Chapter 5: Seeds of Control, The Rise of Roundup. After Anniston, you would think Monsanto might have learned their lesson. That, maybe they would have stopped pushing dangerous chemicals onto the world. But the truth, that was only the beginning. If Anniston was a tragedy contained to one town, what came next would spread across the globe. In the 1970s, Monsanto was on the hunt for their next big product, and they found it in a chemical called glyphosate. At first, it seemed like the miracle farmers had been waiting for. Marketed under the name Roundup, this herbicide promised to do something revolutionary: kill weeds quickly, effectively, and cheaply. Farmers bought it in droves. Imagine being told that your crops would finally be protected, that you could grow more food, make more money, and feed more people. It sounded like progress. But progress always has a price, and with Monsanto, that price was never small. See, Roundup was what scientists call a non-selective herbicide. That means it didn't just kill weeds, it killed everything: corn, soybeans, tomatoes, cotton. If the chemical touched it, it died. For farmers, this meant they had to be incredibly precise when spraying or risk wiping out their entire crop. At first, people accepted this risk. Roundup was too effective to ignore. By the 1980s, millions of pounds were being sprayed on farmland across America. The landscape of agriculture was shifting, and Monsanto was at the center of it all. But behind closed doors, they were asking themselves a different question. Instead of changing Roundup to make it less destructive, what if they changed the crops themselves? And that's when everything about farming and the food on our plates changed forever. In the mid-1990s, Monsanto introduced something that sounded like science fiction: genetically modified seeds. These weren't seeds you could save from one harvest and replant the next season. No, these were patented lab-engineered super seeds that were designed to resist Roundup itself. Think about how wild that is. Monsanto created a problem, the fact that Roundup killed everything, and then sold the solution seeds that could survive being sprayed with the very poison Monsanto sold. Farmers now needed both the seeds and the Roundup to succeed. It was a closed loop, perfectly engineered to make Monsanto billions. At first, people marveled at it, crops that didn't die when exposed to herbicide. It felt like magic, but the reality was far darker. Farmers who had once been independent suddenly found themselves locked into contracts. They weren't allowed to save seeds from year to year, a practice as old as farming itself. If they tried, Monsanto would sue them, and Monsanto wasn't bluffing. They hired private investigators to spy on farmers, took samples from their fields, and even ran radio ads exposing those who tried to replant seeds without paying Monsanto again. It wasn't just about controlling crops, it was about controlling farmers' lives. Meanwhile, Roundup use skyrocketed. With genetically modified seeds immune to its effects, farmers sprayed more and more year after year. By the early 2000s, millions of acres of farmland were dependent on this cycle. Monsanto had achieved something chilling. They didn't just sell chemicals, they controlled the very foundation of our food supply. And for everyday people, the ones buying food at grocery stores, we had no idea. No idea that what we thought was progress in farming was actually the start of a corporate monopoly that would change not just agriculture, but public health forever. I remember reading about this shift and feeling my stomach turn. Farming was no longer about the farmer, it was about Monsanto. And once they controlled the seeds, they controlled everything. But the story doesn't end there. Because while Monsanto was tightening its grip on agriculture, evidence was mounting. That glyphosate, the so-called miracle chemical at the heart of Roundup, wasn't as safe as the company claimed. In fact, it was leaving behind a trail of illness lawsuits and shattered lives. And that's where the next chapter begins. Chapter 6: The Hidden Cost, Glyphosate and the Human Body. When Roundup first hit the market, Monsanto painted it as a miracle. Safe, effective, harmless to humans. Farmers were told they could spray it on their fields without fear that it would only target weeds, not people. And for years, most of us believed that story. But the truth was far more unsettling. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, wasn't just killing weeds, it was seeping into the soil, the water, the air, and eventually into our bodies. I remember reading a report from the World Health Organization in 2015 that made my jaw drop. They classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. Probably carcinogenic. That means cancer. Suddenly, the chemical that had been sold as a harmless farming tool was being linked to some of the deadliest diseases we know. And it wasn't just cancer. Researchers started connecting glyphosate exposure to neurological disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, as well as reproductive issues, hormone disruption, and birth defects. The same way Agent Orange had left a toxic legacy, Roundup seemed to be following in its footsteps quietly, silently, inside people's homes and bodies. Think about it, glyphosate was sprayed on millions of acres of farmland every year. It coated the crops that were later processed into bread cereal, pasta snacks, baby food. It wasn't just on the outside where you could wash it off, it had worked its way inside the plants, inside the food, inside us. And farmers, the very people Monsanto promised to help, were among the first to feel the cost. One of the cases that shook me the most was Dwayne Johnson, a school groundskeeper in California. He used Roundup on the job for years, believing it was safe. Then he developed terminal cancer. In 2018, he became the first person to take Monsanto to court and win. A jury awarded him $289 million in damages, later reduced, but still a historic moment. It was a sign that the world was finally waking up. But Monsanto didn't back down. They denied the link to cancer, funded their own studies, and flooded the conversation with doubt. It felt like history repeating itself. Just like with PCBs and Anniston, just like with Agent Orange, they denied, delayed, and distracted while people got sick. And here's the part that makes me sick to my stomach by the time those lawsuits began piling up. Glyphosate was already everywhere. A 2019 study found traces of it in oat products, cereals, even baby snacks sold in American grocery stores. Imagine feeding your child food that could be contaminated with a chemical linked to cancer. It's horrifying. Farmers weren't just dealing with the pressure of Monsanto's contracts and lawsuits. They were also dealing with the guilt of wondering if their work, their crops, their way of life was poisoning the very people they wanted to feed. And the worst part, Monsanto knew. They knew their own studies showed risks. But instead of warning the public, they buried the evidence. They manipulated data. They used their power to silence scientists. The pattern was impossible to ignore. For me, this was the breaking point. Roundup wasn't just another product, it was proof that Monsanto's influence reached far beyond the farm. They weren't just shaping agriculture anymore, they were shaping public health. And people were paying the price with their lives. But even with mounting lawsuits and evidence, Monsanto didn't stop. In fact, they doubled down. They found new ways to protect themselves, new ways to hide, and eventually a new name to disappear behind. And that's exactly what we'll uncover in the next chapter. Chapter 7. Corporate Camouflage. Monsanto becomes Bayer. By the time Roundup lawsuits started making headlines, Monsanto's name had already become toxic. To the public, it wasn't just a company anymore, it was a symbol of corporate greed, environmental destruction, and human suffering. The kind of name that made people shake their heads and say, of course it was Monsanto. So what did they do? They disappeared. In 2018, Monsanto was acquired by Bayer, the massive German pharmaceutical and chemical company, for a staggering $63 billion. Think about that number for a second. $63 billion. That's not just a business deal, that's a lifeline. A clean slate. Overnight, the Monsanto name was erased. No more Monsanto.com. No more press releases under that brand. They folded into Bayer like a ghost, swallowed up by a larger shadow. And for Bayer, this was both an opportunity and a nightmare. See, Bayer wasn't some unknown player. This is the company that gave the world aspirin, the one that advertised itself as a trusted name in medicine. Families bought their products at drugstores without a second thought. But now suddenly Bayer wasn't just the aspirin company, they were the heirs to Monsanto's empire of controversy. And the lawsuits, they didn't go away. In fact, Bayer inherited nearly 95,000 lawsuits tied to Roundup and glyphosate exposure. Think about that, 95,000 people claiming they had been poisoned, sickened, or lost loved ones because of this chemical. The weight of those cases was so heavy that Bayer agreed to pay $10 billion to settle. $10 billion. On one hand, it sounds like justice. Like Monsanto now, Bayer was finally being held accountable. But when you break it down, it starts to feel like the same story all over again. For a company that large, $10 billion was just the cost of doing business. It didn't change the fact that Roundup was still being sold. It didn't undo the damage already done. And here's what really gets me, even after all that, Bayer didn't stop. Roundup didn't disappear from the shelves. Instead, they quietly shifted their messaging. In 2023, they announced they'd stop selling it to residential customers, everyday people like you and me. But for commercial farmers, the ones producing the food that ends up in every supermarket aisle, Roundup is still out there sprayed on millions of acres. It's like they removed the poison from your backyard but left it in your kitchen. For me, the rebrand to Bayer felt less like accountability and more like camouflage. A way to bury Monsanto's name, to let it fade into history, while the same practices, the same products continued under a different label. Because how do you sue a ghost? How do you hold accountable a company that technically doesn't exist anymore? And Bayer knew that. They knew that by swallowing Monsanto, they weren't just buying a company, they were buying time protection and distance from the Monsanto legacy. But the truth is, you can't erase a history this dark. Not with money, not with mergers, not with new names. The damage Monsanto did to farmers, to families, to entire countries lives on. And Bayer can't just wash that away. So the question becomes, what happens when a company that powerful with a history, that destructive, is allowed to keep going under a new name, and how much more damage can they do before someone finally stops them? That's what the next chapter reveals. Chapter 8: Seeds of Power. How Monsanto Controlled Farmers. By the time Roundup hit the market, farming in America was already changing. But when Monsanto introduced their genetically modified super seeds in 1996, everything shifted. At first, it sounded like magic. Seeds that could survive Roundup's deadly spray, immune to the very chemicals designed to kill everything else. Farmers could spray entire fields, wipe out weeds, and their crops would thrive. It seemed like a miracle solution to one of farming's oldest problems. But there was a catch. See, these weren't just seeds anymore. These were Monsanto's seeds. And when you bought them, you weren't just buying a bag of grain, you were signing a contract. A contract that said you couldn't save seeds from your own harvest to plant the next season, something farmers had done for centuries. Instead, you had to buy new seeds from Monsanto every single year. If you didn't, well, Monsanto had ways of finding out. This is the part that still chills me. Monsanto created its own kind of private police force known as auditors. They'd show up unannounced at farms, take samples, and test them. They'd monitor communities looking for brown bagging, that's what they called it, when farmers reused seeds. And if Monsanto suspected you, they didn't just come after you quietly. They went public. Local radio stations would broadcast farmers' names accusing them of stealing Monsanto's property. Imagine living in a small farming town and suddenly your name is on the radio branded as a thief. That kind of humiliation was intentional. It kept people in line. They even set up a hotline where neighbors could snitch on each other. Families turned against families all because of seeds. And when that wasn't enough, Monsanto went straight to the courts. By the 2000s, they had sued over 800 farmers. Think about that for a second. Hundreds of hardworking people dragged into lawsuits against a billion-dollar corporation. Most couldn't afford to fight back. Many settled. Others lost their land. For Monsanto, it wasn't just about money, it was about control. They wanted farmers to know they owned the very foundation of their livelihood. And here's the thing that gets me: Monsanto was already making billions. In the year 2000 alone, they pulled in over $5 billion in profit. Yet they still went after small-town farmers like they were enemies in a war. It was intimidation on a massive scale, and it worked. Farmers across America realized they had only two choices: play by Monsanto's rules or go bankrupt. What started as a promise of innovation had become a stranglehold. Monsanto didn't just change the way food was grown, they controlled it. From the seeds in the ground to the chemicals sprayed on them, everything flowed back to one company. And while all this was happening, something darker was brewing, because Roundup wasn't as safe as Monsanto wanted everyone to believe. That's where the story goes next. Chapter 9: Poison in the Fields. Roundup and the Cancer Connection. For years, Monsanto sold Roundup like it was water. Safe, effective, revolutionary, that's what the ads promised. Farmers trusted it, homeowners sprayed it on their gardens, schools even used it on playgrounds. It was everywhere. And then the whispers started. By the early 2000s, doctors and scientists began connecting glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, to something far more sinister: cancer. Farmers were showing up with rare forms of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Groundskeepers, landscapers, ordinary people, all facing devastating diagnoses. At first, Monsanto brushed it off. They insisted glyphosate was harmless in small amounts. They pointed to studies, many of which they themselves had funded, that proved there was no link. But then in 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer dropped a bombshell. They classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. Probably carcinogenic. That phrase alone should have been enough to make every alarm bell ring. But Monsanto doubled down. They said the science was flawed, that the studies were misleading. They had too much to lose to admit the truth. And that's when the lawsuits began to pile up. One of the most famous cases was a school groundskeeper named Dwayne Johnson. He used Roundup regularly as part of his job. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he decided to take Monsanto to court. In 2018, a jury sided with him, awarding him $289 million in damages. The number was later reduced, but the message was clear: Monsanto had been caught. That case opened the floodgates. Suddenly, thousands of farmers, workers, and families were suing. Each story was heartbreaking people who had trusted a product for decades, only to find out it may have poisoned them. And the evidence kept growing. Internal Monsanto documents leaked, showing that the company knew about the risks, but worked aggressively to bury the science, manipulate studies, and silence critics. I can't shake the feeling of betrayal here. These weren't people looking for a fight. They were just trying to make a living, feed their families, or take care of their homes. And yet a corporation with billions in profit had gambled with their lives. In the end, Bayer, the new parent company, agreed to pay $10 billion to settle nearly 95,000 lawsuits. $10 billion. It sounds like justice, right? But when you divide that up among thousands of victims, many of whom lost their health, their homes, or even their lives, it feels less like justice and more like hush money. And here's the kicker. Roundup is still being sold, maybe not on the shelves for residential use, but commercial farmers, they're still spraying it on the crops that end up in our supermarkets. And because Monsanto's patent expired in 2000, glyphosate isn't just in Roundup anymore, it's in over 750 products worldwide. That means the chemical linked to cancer, the one at the center of thousands of lawsuits, is still inside the food we eat every single day. To me, this is the scariest part of the story. Because it's not just about the lawsuits or the payouts or even the cancer clusters, it's about the fact that no matter how much evidence piles up, the system allows it to continue. The product lives on even when the people it harmed are gone. And that leaves me with one chilling question: if a company can knowingly poison the world and still survive, what else are they hiding? That's where we head in the final chapter. Chapter 10. The Ghost of Monsanto, a Legacy That Haunts Us. When Bayer bought Monsanto in 2018, the name disappeared. No more Monsanto logos, no more press releases, no more public face to point a finger at. But erasing a name doesn't erase a legacy. And Monsanto's legacy still lingers in the soil, in the water, in the food on our plates, and in the lives of people forever changed. That's the thing about corporate crime. It doesn't always look like a gun, or a mask, or a break-in. Sometimes it's slow, invisible, creeping through communities until the damage is too deep to undo. And by the time people realize what's happening, it's already too late. Monsanto promised innovation, but what it delivered was control. They promised progress, but left behind poisoned towns like Anniston, devastated landscapes across Vietnam, and generations born with illnesses tied to chemicals that should never have been used. They promised safety while hiding the truth about glyphosate, Agent Orange, and PCBs. Even now, decades later, Monsanto is gone in name only. Its products are still in our food system. Its seeds are still planted in our soil. Its chemicals are still shaping our health and our environment. And its shadow lives on inside Bayer, a company that may not have created the monster, but certainly chose to inherit it. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. Because if a company can rebrand pay settlements and keep selling the same dangerous products under a new name, what does accountability even mean? Who really pays the price, besides the farmers, the workers, the families, the children who never had a choice? To me, Monsanto is more than just a corporation. It's a cautionary tale. A reminder that progress without ethics is dangerous, that unchecked power always leaves victims. And that when corporations become too big, too rich, and too protected, justice rarely feels like justice at all. Monsanto may be a ghost now, but ghosts have a way of haunting us. And this one, it's not going anywhere. And that's the story. Monsanto may have disappeared as a name, but its legacy lives on in our environment, in our food, and in the lives of countless people still suffering from its impact. It's a reminder that corporate crimes can be just as devastating as any headline-making murder or scandal. Thank you for spending this time with me on True Crime Echoes. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Can a company truly bury its past, or do ghosts like Monsanto always find a way to haunt us? Until next time, take care of yourselves. Question what you're told and remember, the truth always echoes.